Hello, you've tuned into State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Naitara Narayanan. Himal turns 38 this month. In May 1987, Himal put out its very first issue. Today, we're an online publication that still runs as an independent magazine, completely free of government and corporate interests. Help us celebrate our birthday and continue uncompromised South Asian journalism by becoming a paying patron. We need your support now more than ever before. Go to our website and click on Support Himal. You can become a patron for as little as $5 per month. Earlier this month, the Government of India released data which showed that the toll of the Covid-19 pandemic had been much worse than it has so far acknowledged. The new data on the civil registration system, that is, the country's official record of births and deaths, showed about 3.7 million excess deaths during the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021. Until now, India has maintained that its official COVID-19 death toll has been only a little more than about 533,000. The new data shows that India likely undercounted its COVID deaths by about 7 times. Now remember, India was one of the worst affected countries, especially during a deadly second wave in the summer of 2021, when infection rates surged in urban and rural areas, when hospitals ran out of beds and oxygen, and bodies were being disposed of in mass cremations and burials. The government's handling of the crisis left much to be desired, one of the biggest problems being its reluctance to share information transparently, downplaying the actual risks and impact of COVID in India. However, reporters on the ground had consistently been reporting about how undercounting was taking place throughout the pandemic years. Joining me on the podcast today is Vidya Krishnan, a health journalist, author of Phantom Plague: How Tuberculosis Shaped History, and contributor to Covid-19: A View from the Margins, in which she actually documented undercounting of deaths during the pandemic. Vidya has written extensively about public health in India, and she also wrote several critical pieces on the Modi government's handling of the crisis. Vidya, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Vidya, just to get into the nitty-gritties of these numbers. Now, as a reporter on the ground, this did not come as a surprise to you at all. But can you just explain what excess deaths are, how they're calculated, and what this number signifies, this 3.7 million excess deaths?
Basically, each country has a predicted mortality that is arrived at based on things like seasonal flu and disease burdens, say, of the last 5 years. So that gives you a fair idea of how many people are likely to die, how many people is similar with our fertility rates. We know how many births we expect. When there is a huge aberration between our expectation of how many are alive and how many have died, like in this case, there's a pandemic, that is counted how the pandemic impacted this specific country, the observed actual amount of deaths compared to what we expected, that is excess mortality. And the thing is, I actually don't want to get into statistics at all, because after a while, the number of zeros stop counting as human beings. We are talking in these numbers and we are not processing that each one of them, was somebody's husband and wife, and children and families were destroyed. Like if you're talking about 3 million families that were destroyed, I am more interested in the amount of gaslighting the government did at that point, where it denied all of these deaths for 5 years. There is no accountability. And whether it's 3.7 million or 1.2 million, or, the actual bigger issue here is we are willing to go to war with another country and, survive. Like I was in Delhi, there were sirens over our head, and, there's a threat of nuclear winter, and we're doing all of this for 26 dead tourists, which is fine. But then I want to know, what is a proportionate response for 3.7 million dead Indians then,
And, talking about that gaslighting, the government did push back very hard when the WHO actually came out with an estimate, which is a little higher than this number. It was counting about more than 4 million excess deaths. while the government was still hanging on to a much, much lower number, even lower than 1 million. And the government of India pushed back really hard, accusing the WHO of having some sort of agenda. Tell us what happened there.
I'm going to actually take you through, because of course we fought for WHO, but then this government famously fights with everyone who does not agree with them. And WHO was not any exception. It was actually the last person they fought with in Geneva after having fought with journalists and jailed activists and protesters and doctors and epidemiologists and scientists over a blind, like, just it was such a outrageously white lie. What I'm going to do instead is, because we tend to forget what we lived through, so I'm going to just read through a brief reporter's diary from April 2021. This is right before second wave, if you remember.
Right.
So this is my notes combined with my colleague Rajshekhar, who did that lovely story on Mantara for Himal. These are reporters' diaries. So stay with me. So on April 9th, migrants in Delhi start leaving because they are worried about a lockdown again. By 12th April, in Gujarat, BJP leaders are stockpiling remdesivir, which at that point they said is one of the cures, which turned out to be wrong. When people were criticizing them, BJP's Hardeep Puri said that anyone criticizing the government's handling of COVID is actually on the side of the virus. Health Minister Harshvardhan came out and said that he yelled at government officials for not prioritizing cow science. You remember cow shots? They were Ayush therapies they were promoting. Piyush Goyal, at this point, is telling doctors not to give out medical oxygen needlessly. So ration it, because the government has done no procurement. At this time, ABVP, which is BJP's youth wing, is going into COVID wards and doing photo op with patients. Mass cremations had already started. Crematoriums had expanded into parking lots. In Bangalore, also the situation was the same, where the state government had to give permission to cremate people on private land. In Delhi, a pet crematorium was repurposed for human beings, and ashes were blowing into houses that were close to these crematoriums. By 21st April, that there were oxygen riots, where families were chasing supplies of oxygen tanks and looting them. Haryana refused to share oxygen with Delhi. Rural patients obviously died more. BJP's MP Gautam Gambhir at this point was hoarding Fabiflu stock. And in the Supreme Court, Solicitor General Tushar Mehta, who had earlier lied that there was not a single migrant on the street, came out and lied that not a single death happened due to medical oxygen. Through all of this, Central Vista's construction kept going on. In fact, they pulled forward the deadline, saying we need the Prime Minister's residence completed by December. And throughout this period, this month particularly ended with Shahi Snan at the Kumbh that was still held. So it is a surprise to no one that then the cumulative of April's decisions is what led to May, which was worse, because this whole thing already reads bad enough, but May was when the most people died.
Yeah.
And we have such a short amnesia about, this is intergenerational trauma. I lost people that I've still not recovered from. The fact that I have to do this podcast makes me think about this friend of mine who actually did not die from COVID. She needed blood transfusion because she had hemophilia, and she just couldn't reach the hospital, and those were people who just were not counted. I want to say that throughout the this is second wave, but throughout the pandemic, the Indian citizen, the biggest comorbidity an Indian citizen had to deal with was Modi government.
And just coming back to that, the number of excess deaths, there are complicating factors. It may not be necessary that each one of these deaths were due to COVID. Some of them, many of them, of course, were. But there are things like disruptions to healthcare systems, which just made access to medical facilities difficult, and people would have lost their lives in that process, like you described. There's also the question, Vidya, I want to ask you about the actual registration of deaths, right? Now, we haven't had the best track record, but our registration of deaths has gotten much better over the years, at least till 2019. It was in around 90%. 90%, a little more than 90%. Is that a complicating factor in this number in any way, that there were fewer registrations during the pandemic?
India has a imperfect healthcare system and we can do more. But frankly, our surveillance and epidemiology has been, for a low resource setting, a global standard. India reached polio, how we went door to door, how we did surveillance during the polio campaign. These are all, again, with very limited resources. So we had the entire network of mass immunization that we had built over the years, which we used. But if you remember, the first 3 cases of COVID in India came from Kerala. And the minute, and of course, it came from Kerala because they were monitoring the airport at that point, while the rest of, the government was like, oh, Indian summer, the virus will die in the Indian summer. And the minute the 3 cases were reported, the national CDC stopped sharing weekly reports.
Yeah.
It's not that we do not have the logistical bandwidth to collect the data. We have had that. We have experts. With this particular party in power, none of the information was shared in a timely manner, so people could take measures to prepare themselves for the coming pandemic. Again, while we should invest more in our surveillance and epidemiology and build those networks, they did not let us down. Science did not let us down. It was entirely all of these 3.7 million deaths. Now, majority of them are actually because of political decisions, not because of scientific decisions. And at that point, I remember writing for the Atlantic, or one of the magazines that I wrote for. I remember saying that a pandemic is not just about decisions. It is biocide. You're deciding who will live and who will not live. And essentially, what happened is we chose that migrants will not leave. It's okay. They're not worth it. Same was a policy that we extended to marginalized communities. Everything compounds, right, in a pandemic. So if you choose to let minorities, like for the first half, we entirely kept blaming Indian Muslims for spreading it, when the truth is it was the government spreading it. If you remember, there were viral videos of BJP hosting parties where everyone was doing cow urine shots, being encouraged by the government. Gujarat government at quarantine facilities was testing CARDA, on patients. So if you do those kind of things, what else are you expecting? And I personally think even the 3.7 million figure is an undercount.
Right.
It's. I remember writing for Caravan at that point, where that Prime Minister Modi has the habit of spending lives of Indian citizens like pocket change. That is this. That adds up to 3.7 million.
Vidya, I want to focus a minute on two of these political decisions, right? You mentioned the Kumbh Mela, which very quickly was established as a super spreader event. That, of course, happened just before that horrific summer of 2021. And the first was much earlier. It was that lockdown announced on the 22nd of March 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic. Just a few days, about 10 days before that, the government had actually said that this is not a public health emergency, even though the WHO had declared it a month earlier, at the end of January, that it was a global public health emergency. And then the government says, no, it's not. A few days later, Modi announces a lockdown with absolutely no warning. There's just about 8 hours given. A lot of us remember the hardships of all the migrant workers who had to somehow get back home, the students who were trying to get back home. But even from the public health perspective, tell us why this was a bad decision.
So, unlike everywhere in the world, if you look at India's, you remember initially there was this flatten the curve, this kind of language that was suddenly popular. So, if you actually look at the data, unlike everywhere else in the world, in India, so everywhere, like in the US or in at that point in Italy, there was a lot of COVID cases being reported. So when there were a lot of cases, they went on lockdown. What we did is just copy America. And because there was a lockdown there, we did a lockdown here. I think at that point we had like 900 cases or maybe less when we locked down. And it, in fact, it was when we lifted the lockdown because of the humanitarian crisis. The lockdown itself was so, after weeks of denying and not preparing and not doing bulk manufacturing, bulk supply of PPE kits and building on stockpiles and placing orders. The government did none of that. They also kept lying to the citizens because even the citizens did not have cash, and they did not have basic bread and eggs. And I was in Goa at that point, and Goa had one of the most brutal lockdowns where even bread and eggs were not available for days. People died. Goa is not one of those poor states where people die of malnourishment, but that's the brink that the BJP's decisions brought us to. And then, of course, the lockdown was imposed. And once they lifted, by then the migrants were in refugee camps in big collections. And then they went to villages and they actually took the outbreak that was in cities that had been created, and then these people had been boxed in to refugee camps and then told to go home. That's actually how we handled the first lockdown, was very inherently a reason which contributed to how coronavirus spread across India in rural places particularly.
Right. I don't know how much we want to get into the showering petals on doctors and the clapping from balconies, which was all a kind of a grandstanding on the part of the government on how it's handling the crisis, when actually it just made one of the worst public health decisions that it could, right?
We actually, I want to be on record to say that this government is the most unscientific, anti intellectual group of men who don't want to step aside and don't want to learn from people who know better. Because what you say is one aspect of it, but we also forget that they toppled the Congress government in Madhya Pradesh. And once they toppled it, lockdown, this is March. So they toppled the government in Madhya Pradesh, and then lockdown was announced, so the new government, there was no cabinet. So Madhya Pradesh, the outbreak that spread in Bhopal, which is actually very intimately knows mass death because of the gas tragedy. I remember people from Bhopal telling me that this is worse than 1984 when so many people died overnight. Throughout that period, there was no health department, there was no health minister. And there are so many government policies that were simply not about health. You remember this complete violation of our digital rights, where they forced on us this app called Arogya Setu, and all healthcare had to be accessed through Arogya Setu. And we still don't know how this data was used. But the scam of all scams, PM Cares, I could go into each bit of it, because just the toppling of the government and democracy in Madhya Pradesh is its own thing. But PM Cares, when everyone was dying, this government took money from everyone. And again, I remember at this point that the UN wanted to send aid, which was rotting at Delhi airport because of our mismanagement. People who needed all the things, and UN was willing to send aid, but Modi government did not want to look weak by accepting aid, because they were doing what you're saying. They were just self-congratulating at their great handling of the pandemic. And with the little money we have, we are showering petals through choppers on healthcare workers and banging. It was a time of complete lunacy.
Just a note to our listeners that the PM Cares was a fund that was established during the COVID-19 pandemic in India, the Prime Minister's fund for assistance and relief. And there was no accountability. There was no transparency on how the money going into this fund was used. There's a lot written about this.
No, but you're forgetting that they actually collected the money with a stamp. The PMO's insignia was on it when it was announced. But then when RTI applications were filed, they responded saying this is not covered under RTI. And where did all that money go? We have a right to know that.
Right. Vidya, I'm going to come back again to the question of undercounting, right? And there were many ways in which undercounting could have taken place and did take place. One, I mentioned earlier that there were deaths that weren't registered at all, just because there were so many deaths occurring at that point of time that families weren't looking at paperwork. Another is that COVID infections weren't detected in people who, before they died, Or there were people who had pre-existing conditions, and the cause of death was recorded as a pre-existing condition instead of as COVID-19. These are just some of the ways that I remember that COVID deaths were going missing. But can you take us through what you remember from that time, what you documented at the time?
To start off, at a situation of this kind of medical emergency, it is safe to assume that there will be some amount of undercounting, even in the best of systems, because it happens where even when the government is good faith and wants to know its exact toll. But in this case, the government simply did not want to know. So I don't know if you remember that there were these 60 oxygen deaths at Jaipur Golden Hospital, which at that point was alarming. It created news, and again, I don't know how many people remember, but there was a countdown to oxygen supplies running out for patients. That's how it was traumatizing for everyone in that moment. But then when this matter came to court, I think again the Indian governments, I think it was Tushar Mehta, but one of the government lawyers said that these were deaths from comorbidities, not from COVID. So if you died from diabetes, or if you died from I know a lot of people who died from tuberculosis in that period and simply were not counted. Again, that we will talk about how it was so dangerous to take people off HIV and TB medications and cancer medication at that point. And these are diseases that turned drug resistant and added to fatalities. But none of this was being counted because the government wanted to kind of show how good their response is. And again, we forget that at this point, while all of this is happening, our prime minister was donating vaccines at a time where India had vaccinated less than 4% of India's population. And again, there is in all of South Asian countries, there is an issue of undercounting because some of them have weak systems, some of them are just poorly invested, they don't have as much money, but also the scale of the crisis was so big that you do lose out some people in the counting. But this deliberate malice to not count people, and this is why in the start I was saying that there is no point getting fixated on numbers, because the more dangerous thing is this government's ability to completely dismiss lakhs, millions of deaths as business as usual. And again, this news has come to us not with an apology from the government, not with a, oh, we were wrong. None of that. None of the, we should perhaps revisit some of the policies and not make these mistakes. And that I find really dangerous, because we can fixate as much as we want on the 3 million people already dead. But if we don't learn from the mistakes we made and address the gaps that were deliberately created during this time, we will lose millions more to the pandemic, which is more and more. As an infectious disease reporter, I can tell you, with the WHO losing funding from EU and US, we are looking at a future where we will be dealing with no pandemic. India's already home to the hottest of global hotspots for different infectious lung disease, which is tuberculosis. And even that has this level of undercounting, because we want India to be seen as, this big market and good for tourism. And we keep dismissing the bad news. And these are patients who, for no fault of theirs, are contracting a lung disease, which actually no amount of money can save you from. This affects every single one of us. So I am very concerned at this point that the government actually slipped the news in the middle of this fog of war with India and Pakistan. And what that then means is they're not going to do nothing about it.
So in February 2023, Himal contributor Pratinav Anil reviewed a book, Pandemic India, which is David Arnold's reflective study of COVID, cholera, the plague, the Spanish flu, and other historical mass contagions from the time of the British Raj to the Modi government. He writes on how pandemics have always revealed the weakness of the Indian state. You can read that story on our website, himalmag.com. Whether it's reviews or reportage, Himal has the perspective you need to understand South Asia. It takes a lot to do this kind of in-depth, independent journalism, and we rely on listeners like you. You can support the magazine by becoming a paying patron. Click on the link in the episode notes or go to our website himalmag.com and click Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our stories, events, and more. Now back to our conversation with Vidya Krishnan. Vidya, during the pandemic, as we have said, the government was reluctant to share information and data in a transparent manner. And they did have regular press briefings, but they left a lot to be desired. Take us through used to go on at those press briefings. I know this is one of the things that you were quite upset about at the time, and you were very vocal about that. But remind the rest of us what went
Yeah.
on at those press briefings.
So this is Love Agarwal, who, by the way, much after the pandemic, I found out ended up way on that chair in the press briefing because he was in charge of airport surveillance of infectious diseases. And when the first cases came, he was the babu dealing with it. And because he was, well spoken and put together in this way that the government takes pride, he became the face of these briefings. And during those every press briefing, I would do a Twitter thread because these press briefings actually in every other part of the country, the prime minister and the heads of state were talking to the press. But again, our prime minister does not like press briefings at all or conferences at all. So what they essentially would do is instead of informing the public how to protect themselves, they would either throw statistics at them that made no sense, or they would throw jargon which was scientific and technical and did not make sense. But most of all, they use these press conferences drip by drip to go after Tablighi Jamaat specifically and blame minorities. And again, they did this complete pseudoscience where Dr. Vinod Paul from ICMR predicted that on May 16th, India's pandemic will end. And in one of the ironies, May 16th, India reported the maximum cases it ever would throughout the pandemic. And throughout this period, I would live tweet and go on social media and actually call out every statement they were making. And all of this record is entirely in public because at that point, even the public wanted some good faith information in which the government is not dodging responsibility or attacking minority. There was not a single word of, we are sorry this has happened, we are trying our best. And these press briefings actually became one of the most communal points instead of being one of the most scientific, a point where the government disseminates scientific information. But again, it begs the question, if we keep electing a prime minister who does not even show up, because during the second wave the prime minister was missing in action for weeks on end. And if we keep electing a prime minister who does not even feel responsible to turn up in the case of this apocalyptic emergency, what has he done to be worthy of the power he occupies? This is a question we should all be asking because now he himself has admitted that 3.7 million Indians died and he lied about it for 5 years. But if we are not going to hold him to any consequence, then I keep saying this, we are in for more of the same. They will use every crisis to attack minorities in India instead of doing better. I want to say that we believe that we'll get the government we deserve, but we actually get the government we negotiate. And this is the government we keep voting to power. I'm hoping these 3.7 million deaths, excess deaths, not deaths, excess deaths, would count for something.
You mentioned how public memory is so short, and also the pandemic was declared to have come to an end in mid 2023. There are elections in India just a year later. Whether they were counted at that point or not, there were all these 3.7 million excess deaths, so many millions of families who have lost members. How short is public memory that we didn't hold that government and this prime minister accountable?
Isn't that a searching question? Because I realize how politically naive I am after BJP won in UP that year. Because, I kept believing that you may love your party, but you have to vote for your dead. But then even that, the BJP at that point, I remember being out reporting and interviewing people, and people would routinely say that Modi ji nahi hote, to isse bhi zyada log mar. What about these many? This is not normal. Every other country had a 21st century pandemic, and in India, we died like a 14th century Sicilians facing Black Death, with bodies floating in the Ganga and crematoriums run out of space. And then came an election. I genuinely believed that they would not win in UP. I genuinely thought, because it's not something I reported, so people can say I'm an anti-national reporter. And health in India is such a newsrooms are so gendered and sexist that most of health reporters are actually women. So during the pandemic, every female health reporter, Rema Nagarajan, there was Anu Bhuyan at Wire, all female health reporters were reporting while facing rape threats and death threats. And we were watching with our own eyes that bodies were rotting in Delhi's summer in May in a queue outside that Panchpiran Kabristan, and also the crematorium right next to it. That's how short public memory is. We forget what we saw with our own eyes. But I want to believe that, like with this data, you can't hide a truth so big.
What about the rest of South Asia, Vidya? I don't know how much you were watching the region as a whole, but these are countries with similar population densities, smaller economies, in fact. How do you think they handled the pandemic and estimated the infection rates and their casualties?
I did not follow it as closely as India, but this has been consistent across South Asia. I know Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, there was some deliberate undercounting there as well. This is true for Brazil. This is true for many countries which have authoritarian governments. In South Asia, Sri Lanka was one of the countries where I will trust their data more than, say, I will trust the data coming out of Bangladesh, Pakistan, or India. But the thing is, the the deaths in South Asia were also kind of India's responsibility. I mean, some of it is local governance, but some of it is us, because, say, smaller nations like Nepal don't have their own drug manufacturers and vaccine manufacturers, and India prides itself on being the pharmacy of the world. But then we became contract manufacturers for Americans and whoever would throw dollars at us. So, of course, Pakistan and Bangladeshi taka could not match a dollar. So, I think how the Indian industry behaved at that point was seriously questionable, which had a ripple effect on the pandemic response programs of 92 countries in Asia and Africa. And again, all of that is also on Modi government, because at that point we had vaccine my three policy, and I think someone advised our prime minister that he may be may have a shot at a Nobel if he gave away enough vaccines. So instead of saving us and our neighbors, we started giving vaccines to white people.
Hmm.
I mean, these are problems in everything, but I want to believe that countries like Sri Lanka and Nepal actually can address their problems. Even in Bangladesh, their tuberculosis program is not doing as bad as India's is, because they actually look at data and transparently, in good faith manner, responds to the policy challenge. I do not see not a single person in the Indian government or the Indian business pharma sector has actually said a word of that acknowledges the kind of betrayal that was done.
Right. The one thing that we haven't spoken about yet when it comes to this data that was released in the CRS, but points to the kind of political decisions that aggravated the problem. Even in the number of excess deaths varies widely from state to state. So Gujarat and Bihar again have it's shown that they had the most amount of undercounting, while states like Kerala, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, of course, known to have a much better health system and a health reporting system than others. There, the gap was much less when it came to undercounting.
We did not look at it that way, if you remember, in that time, because Kerala was penalized for reporting honestly.
Mm.
They said, oh, after all your, leftist parties, look where that's got you. All your people are dying more while everyone is safe in Uttar Pradesh. That's how they framed it. Uh, And of course, it does not surprise me at all that Gujarat had the most COVID deaths, because our government runs Gujarat like its personal fiefdom. And Gujarat's health secretary was this lady whose name I forget, Miss Ravi. I forget her full name.
Just again, a reminder to our listeners that Gujarat has had a BJP government for many, many years now. Go on, Vidya.
Yeah, and Gujarat's health secretary was the one who was forcibly at that point. You remember, if the fear of it was that someone from the government would come and put a red dot on your door, and then you will be taken away to a quarantine center. As I said, this is not an infectious disease anymore. This is a law and order problem. And of course, the government then used that to go after. We again forget that the government used this to go after students who were protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and activists and journalists. In Gujarat, in particular, I know BJP leaders were going from residential neighborhoods, giving away homeopathy medicine, and saying you can use homeopathy, yoga, and Ayurveda as prophylaxis for COVID. And again, another thing we forget, that India was also the hub of global misinformation for COVID. And what does that say again? MP Bihar, MP again is like Gujarat has had a BJP government for 25 years now, which is where in Bhopal funeral pyres were going on endlessly. Like, on a more serious note, I want to believe some of it is this very Hindu Eastern stoicism, where instead of holding someone who's powerful to account, we just say, oh, it was fated. And we write it off in this stoic manner, because it's so inconvenient to not do that. It then means someone has to come and take accountability, and someone has to be fired. The only person to lose their job, be demoted, did not lose his job, was the Indian Health Minister Harshvardhan, who, if you remember, was famously playing Ludo with his wife and tweeted that photo in public also when everyone was dying. And he did lose his job eventually. But again, like, our leadership in Delhi comes out of Gujarat. They are not accountable to their own state. They are not accountable for what happened in Delhi, which was one of the worst affected in the second wave again. Any other country, the government would lose power over, but not in India, not in 2025.
You said this data was released, A, without any apology from the government, B, just slipped in while everyone was distracted with what was going on between India and Pakistan. It doesn't seem like the government is taking any lessons away. But what do you think, as a country, as a people, and if we had a responsible, responsive government in place, what lessons should we take away from now this acknowledgement of the actual death toll due to COVID?
I think there was so much intergenerational trauma from people who were just abandoned. That's what happened. People were abandoned. The government abdicated its responsibility. And it's okay if the government doesn't acknowledge it, but we know it. We saw it. And from the public health point of view, and I'll again say that the only saving grace in this very dark point in India's history was that people turned up for each other. More people would have died if people did not turn up for each other and start helping, someone to find a hospital bed and oxygen, or with money. But India's public health system at this point is actually not, India is not one of those countries where the doctors don't know what they're doing, or we don't have the science or the expertise to do it. Everyone in public health knew the amount, the scale of lies that we were being told. And on top of it, the government even pressed in Bollywood, and they quickly released a movie called Vaccine War.
Mm.
The amount of propaganda, the truth is, even their best of propaganda cannot drown out the truth. And India's top public health expert actually went into a huddle and put together this book, and so that the lies do not drown out what actually happened. This book, I'm very proud to have contributed 2 chapters to this book. It has 37 chapters from various experts. Everyone came to it with only one intention, that we will leave a record of, we will not let even a single thing be forgotten. And so this book actually records in granular detail every decision the government took. And I do think there are lessons to be learned from these kind of records that came out. One of the biggest lessons I feel, it's almost wishful, naive thinking again on my part. I seem to not learn at all, is that you cannot respond to infectious diseases by alienating the public. You have to take the community in confidence. That is actually how we contained our HIV community epidemic. When the world dismissed us as saying we'll never control HIV in India, we took commercial sex workers and truck drivers and all high risk communities were taken into confidence. You cannot control a pandemic if the government has no trust, doesn't trust its own people, doesn't trust its own scientists. I repeatedly did stories for Caravan at that point, noting that the Prime Minister decided to lock us down both times without consulting the National Scientific Task Force. And I guess what are the lessons to be learned? The lessons are that we have to trust science. The only biggest lesson here is that science, India's scientific community did not fail it. In the political community failed it.
Right. Of course, the book you were referring to is COVID-19, A View from the Margins, to which many public health experts and journalists have contributed. You yourself have contributed 2 chapters to that book. Vidya, my last question, give us some more recommendations, and these can be books or movies or other podcasts, for people to understand public health crises in India and maybe in South Asia.
Well, if you want to watch a quick movie that's on Netflix, Fire in the Blood actually is a very good account of our HIV crisis, but it also teaches us India's unique place in the world because it has concentrated pharma manufacturing. At the risk of sounding biased, one of the books that is doing, I wrote it, Phantom Plague, but it is being taught at the Harvard Medical School, and I have taken it around at UCSF and a bunch of Ivy League universities. I do think it is the most realistic account of how race, medicine, colonialism, India's particular brand of authoritarianism impacts its ability to respond to pandemics. I really like. There are so many podcasts, but one of my favorites is called Ology. It's science. It's mostly just each week is a different kind of scientific podcast.
Lovely. I'd also like to recommend to our listeners that they read the 3-part series that you did for Himal recently, which is called Pills, Perils, and Profits, where you really you do a deep dive into South Asian pharmaceutical manufacturing and exports. But Vidya, it's great talking to you today, although not on a happy topic necessarily. But thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That was Vidya Krishnan on the State of South Asia podcast. Go to our website himalmag.com and visit our archives for more stories on COVID and the pandemic in South Asia. You can read Adila Ismail's piece from October last year about Sri Lankan Muslims' lasting pain over COVID-era forced cremations. You'll find the link to that story and many more in the episode notes. Don't forget to tune in to the South Asia Review of Books podcast next week with Shweta Srikanthan. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening, and see you then.